Hi, my name is Tom Stewart, and for the last 6 years I've been making music under the name Occams Laser. Seeing as we're coming to the end of the decade, I thought it would be a great time to look back at my releases so far and to give you a little background as to how I got to this point. In 2013, I was living and working in Brighton in the UK. I was working as part of an admin team in Brighton Hospital dealing with health records. It was during the last year of this job when I shifted my role as one of our team was retiring. After a few months in the job, it turned out the person who had retired had actually died just weeks after leaving. For me, it couldn't be more of a stark realisation that I didn't want to live just to work as a very small cog in the machine. Not long after, I handed in my notice and decided to move back home. Luckily for me, my mum was great during this time and let me stay with her for a full year while I figured out what I wanted to do next. In my spare time since 2009, I had been creating music as a hobby under various different aliases, but none of it was very professionally made and was sloppy at best. But day by day, I focused more on creating new music and trying new things, and soon it was clear that I was actually improving. Backing up even more, I studied philosophy at university, and while studying the term Occam's razor came up in one of our lectures. A basic understanding of this idea is that the simplest answer is usually the correct one. Whilst thinking about what my next pseudonym should be for a music project, the kind of joke name of Occam's Laser suddenly clicked. One final and kind of funny addition to this setup scenario is that due to circumstances I was living in a shed in my mum's garden for the start of my career. The only power came from an extension cable stretched across the garden, which was extremely dodgy. Every thunderstorm or heavy bout of rain was a bit of a stressful endeavour, but all part of the charm. Ultimately, the shed for me was an incentive. It was a goal to succeed and be able to move away from. So finally, I guess we can begin. As with many other artists, I started out mostly creating covers and remixes before I wrote my first original pieces. My first release was a 4-track EP titled 1989, which came out in November of 2014. Not the best start when it came to releasing this on major labels, as Taylor Swift had also released a very similar sounding album titled 1989 around the same time. So I had to change the name of my release to 1989 EP to get around the issue. This 4-track EP was some very basic synthwave ideas that I just wanted to get off my chest and get the ball rolling. As soon as my first release was out, I knew I had to just keep up the momentum, which led to writing and releasing my first full album a few short months later in January of 2015. That album was called Midnight Escape. It's almost become a joke to include the word midnight in a release by this point due to how many times it's been done, but at the time I was definitely not that self-aware of all the synthwave tropes that were beginning to form. This album was a bit of an experiment, and in many ways it was a way for me to stumble my way towards finding my sound. The album included 3 remixes by Renswald, Citizen Cannot and Kenshi, all of which I was very grateful for, and all the artists involved did a great job. In March of 2015, I released an EP called Mnemonic Possession, and in April 2015 I also released an EP called A-Sides. Both of these EPs were a further exploration into sound and style, and acted as quick fixes for me to feel like I was progressing and almost act as a marker for my progression. On May the 1st, 2015, I released a 13-track album called The Road to Fury. With the momentum still going, I jumped headfirst into my first themed album, and this was based on the world of Mad Max. I knew that I wanted to get this album out before the new film Fury Road came out, as I wanted to sort of add to the pre-hype of the new film. This album was also my first attempt at adding vocals to any of my tracks, and as to cut out the middleman, all the vocals were supplied by myself. On June 29th, 2015, I released a 6-track EP called Judgment Day. Not long after the Mad Max themed album, I again set my sights on another franchise that I love. This time it was that of Terminator, and more specifically the second film, Judgment Day. When I look back now, this EP was fun to make, but I'm not sure I should have made it. This again featured some vocals by me. On August 6th, 2015, I released an 11-track album called Take Your Time. An album centred around one track, the track aptly named Take Your Time. When it came out, this track was probably my most famous track, and was covered and remixed perfectly by Voltage, EAR and Stereospread. These covers and remixes featured on the album. This album was very very heavily focused on vocals and the almost cheesy pop side of synthwave, a style I would only briefly reuse once more before avoiding completely. On the 11th of November 2015, I released an 11-track album called Power Up. Power Up marked a change, or at least a start to a chain of events that would lead to my switch to Darksynth. This album again featured vocals by me, but also a slightly darker undertone to the music. Back in October of 2015, I met a very important person in my life. I met my girlfriend, now wife, and the mother of my 2 children. In January of 2016, I decided to write pretty much an EP dedicated to her. The EP was half instrumental, half vocals. It's still a release I look back on very fondly. Funny how it's also the release that marks the full stop end to one of my periods of music, as what came next was massively different and slightly polarising to begin for the fans who'd been following me this far. A lot of people think that when you hear dark, sinister or aggressive music, that whoever wrote such music must also be a similar type of person, or at least have been in a dark, aggressive mindset to write in that style. For me, this could not be more opposite. I find writing darker, brooding music to be a much more happy and cathartic experience. On March 10th of 2016, I released OCCULT 86, which was an 11-track album, the first in what would be currently a quadrilogy. OCCULT 86 was a dark, devilish idea that I cooked up one night, and it was an amazingly fun experience from beginning to end, writing it. The basic idea behind it was an occult cult who were trying to take over the world via the manipulation of music. April 28th, 2016, I released a 6-track EP called CRUCIFIXATION, another delve into the dark, the occult. The title sprang to mind as a sarcastic take on what a lot of Darksynth had become at this point, the fixation with crucifixes, and of course I would embrace some of this iconography and tropes, but sometimes you have to give in to what works. It was also at this point I achieved something that I was extremely proud of. I became fully self-employed as a music producer, and moved out of my little shed and into my girlfriend's house. No more spider bites and cold nights. June 16th, 2016, I released a 9-track album called 9 Circles. Another beginning of another series. This time I wanted to tackle the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. I would end up calling this my Divine Trilogy, and as such, Hell, Purgatory and Heaven were the subjects. 9 Circles focused on the 9 circles of Hell, and I dedicated a track to each level. On July 28th of 2016, I released a 17-track album called The Grid. Old habits die hard, and I wanted to focus again on a franchise that was dear to my heart, the world of Tron. For this album I wanted to effectively create something along the lines of a rescore or alternative soundtrack to the first Tron film. I tried to use authentic age synthesizers and capture the feeling that some of the magnificent tracks from the original score by Wendy Carlos. September 21st of 2016, I released a 10-track album called Purgatory. This was the second in my Divine Trilogy. This album focused on the terraces of Purgatory and dedicated a track to each level of Purgatory. The album was a fun one to make, and at the time I was using it to experiment with new sounds, which I think transferred to the third album, which we'll get to soon. In November of 2016, I released a 6-track EP called Flagellation. I was working on the final part of my Divine Trilogy, but realised I needed to slow down and give it more space, so I sidelined it for a few months, and instead focused my attention on a new EP. Flagellation had similar semi-religious themes, but also had a few vocal tracks which I felt I wanted to re-explore. February 21st, 2017, I released a 10-track album called Ascension, the final part of my Divine Trilogy, and to me this is possibly my best album, or at least the one I am most proud of. This is for a few reasons. It marked the end and completion of a trilogy which was the first for me at this point. It also became my first release to be pressed onto vinyl by Timeslave Recordings, which happened later in 2017. The vinyl had 3 variants, red, black, and red vinyl with black splatter. A few of the tracks from this album were also used by Dr. Disrespect in live streams, which helped this album be heard by a brand new audience. My music featuring on Dr. Disrespect's channel would become a much more frequent affair with subsequent releases, but I have a feeling that this album had caught the eye of one of his admin team, and so it's really the one that started the chain reaction. On May 23rd of 2017, I released a 4-track EP called The 4 Horsemen. It also acted as the end of a secret trilogy of EPs that I have subsequently dubbed my apocalyptic TRIPTYCH. The 3 EPs are Crucifixion, Flagellation and The 4 Horsemen. August 31st, 2017, I released an 11-track album called OCCULT 87. The second in my occult trilogy, this release further explored the darkest ideas and sounds that I could muster, even a few faster paced tracks with vocals thrown in for good measure. At the end of 2017, my wife gave birth to my son, and so I decided for the first time to actually take a break for a few months, primarily so I could focus on looking after my son. This was the longest break I had taken since starting this project. Soon enough though, I began again writing more music, and the idea of New Blood was something that felt natural. It served as a great title in terms of topic, as I spun a story around a synthetic blood that takes over hosts' bodies. This was the inspiration for how I imagined the sounds that I wanted to include. Menacing, threatening, but with a layer of mystery and chaos. New Blood for me personally signified literally new blood in the form of my son. This would be something I would re-explore, but that's for later on. The track Quarantine from this album is still my most successful track, and as of this moment it has 700,000 plays on Spotify. Hopefully soon it'll hit that sacred million. This album also had a vinyl release on white vinyl with red splatter, a variant I nicknamed the Tampon, mostly because I'm childish. October 1st, 2018, I released an 11-track album called OCCULT 88. The third of my occult series, this album further explored the idea of an occult cult trying to take over the world via technology. By this point, my occult series had become my playground for trying new sounds and exploring any new techniques. Always fun to write, and some great sounds that I still use to this day began on this release. On April 5th of 2019, I released an 8-track album called Tension. By this point in my career, I'd realised that I was probably creating too much quantity and not enough quality. I've actively tried to slow down how I release music, and part of this means I tend to be working on 4 albums at a time. Tension was an album that I had been slowly working on in the background for a long time. It was an album that was slightly brighter and more hopeful than some of my darker, gritty material. In a way, it acted as a weekend escape from my Darksynth ways, and a chance to refresh my ears. This album was also released on a run of transparent vinyl via Timeslave Recordings. On August 29th of 2019, I released an 11-track album called OCCULT 89. The fourth, and as of right now, the final entry in my occult series. OCCULT 89 compared to OCCULT 88 shows a massive improvement in terms of sound. I made sure to try and learn more and slow down, and for this I think it paid off. The final track on the album was a reimagined version of the first track from OCCULT 86, and so closed the circle of the collection. However, I do have a few ideas on where this series could go next. January 30th, 2020, I released a 24-track album called Return to the Grid. Once again, I felt compelled to revisit a theme that I felt passionate about. This time, it was the second film in the Tron series. Now, Daft Punk had, of course, created a magnificent score for Tron Legacy, and it was also a score I did not want to even try to get close to, as I knew that that would be mad. Instead, I wanted to create a complementary score that had more in common with the sound signature of the first film. I did end up using a lot more modern synths and techniques with this album, as I wanted it to still have a feel of progression from my first exploration of the world of Tron, 3 years prior. 24 tracks may have been too many. In fact, so many that my rear score is longer than the official soundtrack. Whoops. On June 1st, 2020, I released a 10-track album called New Blood 2. My wife was pregnant with our second child when I was working on this album, and so much like when my first child was born, it felt right to attach to the idea of new blood. Much like with previous albums that followed sequentially in any of my series, I felt this album shows a massive improvement in my sound and style compared to the first New Blood album. This album also had a vinyl release, red with white splatter. On October 2nd, 2020, I released an 11-track album called The Odyssey of Noise Volume 1. As of right now, this is my most recent album. It is also the start of another series. Something I haven't talked about is how I make all of my own album art. This has been true from day one and will remain so for the foreseeable future. Making the artwork can sometimes take just as long as writing the music. I'm not the best artist, but what I do have is time, and so I always like a challenge when it comes to the artwork. A few years back, I had the idea to create a singular wide piece of art that could then act as the artwork for a series of albums, and this is how the Odyssey of Noise started as a concept. Not an idea about sound, but rather about the visual album art. Right now, only 1/3 of the full artwork has been unveiled, as there is only one album out. However, as each album is released, the full artwork will take shape and make more sense as a whole. All 3 albums were written at the same time, and so are designed to twist and wind as one singular adventure, much like the artwork. I can't wait for the rest of this story to be revealed, and there's not long to wait, as both subsequent parts will be released in 2021, on January 29th and April 2nd. My first 6 years of writing music have been an extraordinary process, and one I'm very thankful for that I can do as a job. Making music for me has always been about having fun, and part of that fun is learning new things and experimenting. When you sit down to write a song, you never know where it's going to end up, and part of that mystery and part of that process, you get lost and you can ignore what's happening in the real world. And right now, in 2020, I think it's quite evident that everyone needs a little bit of an escape. Hopefully, if you're listening to my music, it can offer a slight escape. If you've made it this far, I can't thank you enough, really. It's due to all the fans around the world, and for you at home, watching this, listening to this, that I get to have the job that I love the most in the world. I hope you're staying safe, take it easy, and enjoy the rest of this year as much as you can. I've been Tom from Occams Laser, and I'll catch you soon.